A little bit about Hastings, for those in the room who don't know too much. Hastings is a specialist infrastructure manager with 14 billion of funds under management as of July 2017. ESG is incorporated into our investment analysis and ongoing portfolio management at both the quantitative and qualitative levels of everything that we do. Hastings has been a UN PRI signatory for several years and is ranked in the upper quartile of the survey results for the last several years. The flagship fund that Hastings manages is Utilities Trust of Australia. UTA, which is the abbreviation, is an open-ended core infrastructure fund available for infrastructure investors. As at 31 July, it comprises 12 assets, principally in Australia and to a lesser extent in the UK and the US, with a net asset value of $6 billion. ESG forms a critical component of UTA's responsible investment strategy. UTA themselves have their own ESG policy in addition to the Hastings ESG policy. And further, the UTA board has a separate ESG subcommittee which comprises 4 members of the board. One of those members is here today, being Rob Jolly, who's the chair of Utilities Trust of Australia Trustee Board. UTA also participated in the inaugural GRESB survey conducted last year and ranked second out of 23 infrastructure funds globally. To date, we haven't got the results yet for 2017, but we eagerly await those results. So one of the things that we discussed at the ESG subcommittee that forms part of the sustainability platform for UTA was the carbon footprinting and why we do it, what's the benefits, and what's the strategy. So after detailed discussion on all this, we decided as a group to undertake a carbon footprint, and to our surprise, we found that we were the actually only infrastructure manager to undertake this. Since then, IFM have also undertaken this work, and our expectation is that other infrastructure managers will also undertake this, and I guess that's consistent with the questionnaire response that we just received just before. So what actually did we do as part of the carbon footprinting? What we did was a bottom-up assessment of each of our assets, building that up to the portfolio. So at the quantitative level, it measured the emissions of each asset to then provide that portfolio picture. And at the qualitative level, we undertook a detailed risk assessment of each asset, including market risk, climate change risk, operational risk, regulatory and reputational risk. Part of the benefits that we see as doing this exercise is naturally increased transparency to investors who, with this work, will complement other data that they get from their other managers in other asset classes. The other key benefit is it provides a deeper understanding of the risk assessment of each asset and opportunities for carbon reduction, which ultimately will lead to adding value to the assets and ultimately to the portfolio. So looking specifically at climate change risk, which is a key part of the carbon footprinting exercise that we did, understanding the emissions profile of each of the assets and the portfolio is an important step in understanding the key risks that present themselves for climate change risks as seen on the slide on the screen. So what exactly did we measure? Well, Under the Global Greenhouse Protocol, there's an established protocol in place that measures Scope 1 being direct emissions owned and controlled by each asset, and Scope 2 being the emissions associated with purchased electricity. The third, and probably the most controversial, is Scope 3, which is indirect emissions that are created from participants who use these assets. For example, for airports, it would be the emissions that the airlines transmit. For ports, it would be the ships the emissions that are transmitted from there. There's been a lot of debate around, in measuring carbon footprinting, whether it should include Scope 3. However, the protocol is clear on measuring Scope 1 and 2. That said, that doesn't... Part of the strategy at each asset level is to influence the emissions that each of our partners who use our assets emit. And Amelia will touch on that in her experiences at Queensland Airport. So we've outlined 11 assets that comprise the UTA portfolio. There is one more asset, being the Land Titles Office of New South Wales, which UTA acquired an interest in at 30 June. That's not presented here because its emissions are quite low by the nature of the nature of the asset. What you can see on this slide is the key source of emissions that each asset represents. So in the transmission space, there's transmission losses, and also in the gas distribution, there's fugitive emissions through leaks in the distribution network. And in the airports, it's principally electricity that's purchased, albeit that there is some on-site generation both at Perth Airport through their cogeneration facilities, and also at Melbourne Airport through their tri-generation facilities that's just come online this year. The other point to note from this slide is Sydney Desalination actually emits zero emissions, as it procures all of its energy from renewable energy sources. Presented on this slide is the breakup of the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. This breakup came as a little bit of a surprise to us, as we were expecting Scope 2 to be higher than Scope 1. However, the assets of South West Generation, being power generation, and Phoenix Natural Gas skewed that, as well as the Scope 1 emissions from the airports. That said, the majority of our assets in our portfolio were Scope 2, given the nature of their activities. We've then presented the emissions according to their carbon intensity. And this is where it gets challenging in terms of comparing what carbon intensity actually means. In this case here, carbon intensity is the emissions that are measured as a percentage of UTA's legal ownership in each asset divided by its net asset value. What you can see from this graph is that there's no correlation between the net asset value and the emissions that are presented, and that typically the energy assets are the bulk of the emissions and comprise approximately a ratio of 3:1 in terms of their emissions relative to their net asset value. That said, it's no surprise by the nature of the activities that they do. Similarly, on the airport side, the opposite is true as well. That doesn't mean that there's not work to do in terms of improving the carbon footprint of our airport assets. It just highlights differences within our portfolio. And again, Amelia will touch on the experiences that they've had at Qual Airport. The other thing that was challenging in terms of looking at this data was how do we actually compare the data? So for airports, we compare it by passengers. For transmission lines, we compared it to the number of the kilometres of transmission lines. Similarly for pipeline distribution assets, the same. For ports, we compared it to tonnages and throughput that went through the ports. What we found when we compared the assets in each category was that it typically asked more questions than what it did answers. And I guess part of the reason for that is the data as it stands at the moment is limited. And I think the benefit of the work that we're doing, the work that IFM are doing, and hopefully the work that others will do, will present a richer data source to enable the comparison and the benchmarking of each of these sub-asset categories. And that's one of the key benefits that we see as part of this push to measure the carbon emissions. It is the beginning of the journey in terms of this work, but it's an important part nonetheless. So as already touched on, the key themes that came out of our carbon footprinting was that naturally the energy sector have the highest carbon risks, and Scope 2 comprise the bulk of our assets in terms of their emissions. Equally, there's increasing physical risks associated with climate change that we found on all our assets. That was no surprise to us, but I guess confirmed our earlier thoughts on the subject. It also confirmed that there's new opportunities that will arise from climate change in other areas. And the other thing that we did, which I'll touch on the study, was that we measured the sensitivity of the portfolio to a change in current policy and regulation. So we undertook a number of scenario testing, applying different carbon taxes to the portfolio. So we did one at a flat price across the portfolio, and then we applied other in-country prices based on past regulation to each of the assets comprising the portfolio. The results of that were quite interesting and confirmed that the sensitivity of the portfolio is not that sensitive, and the actual carbon cost that would be generated should such a tax be imposed was less than 1% of the net asset value of the portfolio. So as I mentioned before, this is very much the beginning of our journey into carbon footprinting and more broadly into sustainability for UTA and for Hastings. As it stands at the moment, we're still in the process of interrogating the data. And what I mean by that is when we drill down to the detail and we try to benchmark that data, there are a number of inconsistencies that we are working on, and hopefully in time that data set will become richer and will provide greater comparison. We're working with the management teams of each of our assets to educate them on their footprint, and B, work with them to see what opportunities lie to improve their carbon footprint. So what we mean by that is for Scope 1 emissions, it's principally improving their operational efficiencies, and for Scope 2, it's looking at other purchased electricity sources such as renewable, as well as improving the energy efficiency of their operations through technology and change behaviour. I'll now hand over to my colleague Amelia, who'll provide a bit more detail on what they've actually experienced at the Queensland airports across their portfolio of 4 assets. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Richard. That was great. Look, for Queensland Airports, I'm here as a bit of a case study, I think, today. But for those of you who don't know Queensland Airports, we're a group of airports, 4 of them, specifically located in Queensland. So Gold Coast, Townsville, Mount Isa and Longreach. And we operate as a group, essentially, but when you look at the different demographics and the different markets that we operate in, you can see that there'd be different challenges when we talk about sustainability. So we'll cover a little bit about that today. But certainly, for your benefit, our strategy as a group of airports is underpinned by 5 strategic pillars. And those I've put up there are shareholder value, customer experience, social responsibility, high-performing workforce, and accomplished operators. And of relevance today for us is clearly the social responsibility pillar. Our philosophy on ESG basically sits within that pillar, and everything that we do in that space is around supporting that pillar to therefore drive long-term shareholder value. So if you look at our annual reports, you'll see that we talk about this concept called pathway to sustainability. And for me, I guess that comes across in 3 ways, and I'll talk about a 4th in a second. The first one's what I call compliance-driven. So what do we need to do in the environmental space? What do we need to do when we're looking at construction and considerations we have to make either by way of the Airports Act or certainly for any other legislation that's in place for our jurisdiction? The second piece is business efficiency. So when we're looking at investing and making some decisions around sustainability, we clearly need to make sure that the numbers stack up. And if they don't, I'm sure we'll hear about it. But certainly, energy, water and waste are critical for us. And Richard talked about, us being a big electricity consumption user. So you can see that that's a big focus for us. And the last one's reputation, so corporate responsibility. We have that obviously in 4 different communities. Our reputation is critical for us. So how we approach sustainability, and if you look at our websites for all 4 airports, you'll see that we do have a component in our websites about environment and how we approach that. And again, I'll give you some examples in a moment. The last one that's not there, and I believe we really need to push, is probably culture. So, do we have a culture as an organisation of sustainability? I would say we do, but it probably can be stronger. And as Richard said, we are in an infancy, maturity type phase at the moment. Certainly our airports are. And so that culture piece actually needs to be in everything that we do. And I'll cover that off at the end because I think, culture really does drive how you operate and therefore drives the long-term value. So very important point, I think, that we need to remind ourselves on. In terms of risk, so for Qual, risk management's top of mind, as you would expect. And really our biggest risk at the airport space is the consumption that we have on natural resources. And for an airport, as you can appreciate, it'll be things like, our capital projects, it'll be things like airfield operations, including the ground transport. And as Richard also said, the airlines that we have, all of what they do impacts all of what we are. So it's a very triangulated, I guess, risk profile. And as we move forward and mature in this space, we'll be looking very closely at not only regulatory risks, but things like technology risks, and also looking for opportunities. So there's a lot of stuff out there around low emissions technology. We do need to spend some time exploring that, and really that's part of our future. So sustainability for Qual, I guess just a couple of things generally. So revegetation, waste and water are fairly typical. For example, at Gold Coast Airport, our water harvesting system, all the rainwater that we collect and all of the condensation from our air conditioning units all go into a harvesting system. At the moment, we're actually using only 60% of what we need to use. So 40% of that is captured through the system. So that's a great plus for us and a good example of where we probably can do more, but certainly from a water perspective that has been a success for us. On waste, no different to what you would see in other airports, but we do, recycling. We make sure there's common storage space for our tenants to do recycling and store things like organics and recyclable materials and waste materials. Again, if you compare us to another airport, and there is one up north, they do really well in this space. They've got a lot of focus on what their tenants do. And again, I'll talk about our partnerships, but we can do more in this space. In terms of carbon, look, I think, the carbon footprinting that Richard talked about is high on our agenda. We've done it for Gold Coast and we've done it for Townsville. And again, I'll share the example, but to do that has taken about 8 months per airport. And really, the Gold Coast has had a real success in this space. But in order for us to get accredited, and we'll talk about that, certainly the carbon footprinting exercise has been done at Qual, and we'll continue to do that as we move through the levels of carbon accreditation. In terms of the emissions reduction strategy, solar's a big one. We've got examples. LED lighting's another big one. We do that across all of our airports, so not only in the terminal and the footprint around the terminal, but in the airfield, on the runway. So again, trying to make sure that every touch point that we own and operate on, we have some element of LED lighting to help save the electricity. Same with air conditioning and metering. We also do a lot of that in our airports. One thing I will comment on this is, as an airport, and as you know, we have major capital development programs. So one of the things we do need to do as part of our strategy is to consider using low carbon materials in our construction, or even in our negotiations with suppliers on that. So if you look at some of the other great airports out there, I think Oslo is one of them, they use a lot of low carbon materials, building materials to build, or low carbon concrete, wooden materials that are maybe recyclable, or certainly forestry, sustainable forestry type materials, really good stuff to actually build what they're doing at the airport. Now for us, that comes at a cost, and nothing that we do can't be, looked at in isolation. It has to have, the numbers have to stack up. So again, things nice to say we can do it, but again, it's at a cost. So the guys in projects in our team, they're certainly looking at that as possibilities. So Gold Coast Airport, just very quickly, it's our largest airport, 6.5 million passengers a year, around 380 services a week. They've actually achieved level 1 carbon accreditation in 2016. And what that means is they've gone through a mapping exercise. And ACI do the accreditation. So for those of you who don't know, ACI is the the Airports Council International. They accredit all the airports that you hear about that are carbon accredited. So we are level 1 at Gold Coast Airport, and we're now working on level 2. The difference between the two, just to give you some insight, level 1's about mapping, it's about committing to a policy, committing to certain initiatives, but level 2 is actually about proving those initiatives and that you've delivered against those initiatives. And you often need about a rolling 3-year average baseline to actually prove a reduction in your carbon emissions. So it's the level 2 is a little bit more complicated, but Gold Coast Airport at this time are under level 2 and going through level 2 for this next 12 months. I've put ILS up there. For those of you who live on the Gold Coast or are aware of the Gold Coast, it's been a topical issue for us at Queensland Airports. Basically, it's the instrument landing system that we put on at airports, and most airports have it. It increases safety for aircraft to land in poor weather. And with Brisbane up the road, which I hope none of you flew through today, they have it, but we obviously have to divert a lot of our aircraft to Brisbane in poor weather just for safety reasons. So we're installing an ILS, and there's been a lot of noise on the Gold Coast about that. But one of the positive outcomes, even though we are wearing very much an environment and a cultural heritage hat when we do this, is that by reducing the diversions, we're reducing fuel burn reduction. So really, that's a really positive outcome for us as an airport if we can do that, for the greater good, if you like. So it's a topical one, but it's just an interesting point to note. Emissions reduction strategy for Gold Coast, that's clearly underway now as part of level 2, as I said. And what that means is we need to establish some really strong targets around what our electricity consumption reduction might be over the course of the next 20 years. You'll see a graph on the bottom right there, which is intentionally small, because we haven't actually agreed on the targets yet. But you can see that there is clearly work underway in assessing what those targets should be and making sure that in the business cases that we put together, the investment analysis around that, as I said, has to stack up, not only from a social, political, environment outcome perspective, but from a financial and operational efficiency perspective. So that's part of the philosophy, if you like, of us getting level 2, is getting targets, getting business cases built in, engaging our stakeholders, and primarily when I say that for this particular effort is our investors, our board, all of the people that we work with, making sure there's buy-in that this is actually really important for us as an organisation. And then reporting. And those of you, I think everyone here would agree, if you don't have targets and you don't measure them and you don't report on them, you probably don't hold yourself accountable. So for us, that's a very big part we have to play in maturing as an organisation. But certainly that's what we're doing now as level 2 is underway. Gold Coast is also undergoing a major solar opportunity review. So this is the footprint for Gold Coast Airport. I know it's really a bit complicated, but that big green line, just to give you some sense, is actually the border of New South Wales and Queensland. So our runway is cut in half by 2 different states. Pretty complicated, pretty much of a nightmare really. But therefore, when we're looking at things like solar and other carbon reduction strategies, we have to consider 2 states' jurisdictions, 2 councils. It just gets really complicated. And we actually do a very good job. The team does a very good job, I should say, on this. But what we're doing here is we're really trying to identify, where can the government play a part in our solar review, given we have 2 states, and really where are the largest opportunities for us when we look at the solar. So our existing footprint is the existing terminal you might have seen, it's the existing apron and the airfield space, but we're in the middle of a major capital development program at the moment, and the reason for that is clearly driven by growth and the capacity constraints we have at the airport. And again, Gold Coast has grown a lot in the last 10 years. So part of that capital development is expanding our apron space and expanding the terminal. And if we can do that and increase our footprint, and particularly, roof and the roofs of the terminal and the car park, we can certainly increase our solar penetration in there. So a lot of stuff happening in that space, and I know the team are working really hard on that. Townsville Airport. So Townsville Airport's our second biggest airport, around 1.5 million passengers. At the moment, they're on their journey of carbon accreditation. So they haven't achieved 1, but interestingly enough, I know they're trying to leapfrog 1 and go straight to 2. I did ask a lot of questions about that because I didn't think that was possible, but apparently it is. So what they're doing is they've actually been able to show a 3-year rolling average of carbon reduction, and it's only around 5%, but it's evidence. And so the audit of that report is currently being reviewed, and if it gets certified, and this is the certification that ACSI do as well, it is done by an independent verifier, just so you know, then they can actually leapfrog and go straight to level 2. So what they're actually doing is doing level 1 and 2 in parallel. So the other point there I've got is, they are developing a carbon management plan, and that encompasses everything from the electricity reduction targets we're doing in Gold Coast to looking at the HVAC rooms. So for those of you who don't know, it's a heating, ventilation, air conditioning rooms, which is our largest electricity consumption. The building management systems using more LEDs, and here's an interesting one for you, the international terminal at Townsville. So we only have a couple of services for international. It's not a big international presence, but the lighting and the water's connected. So when you've got the lights on, the waters go. But if there's no services all day or even part of the day, there's no reason we can't switch the lighting off and therefore, save in electricity, but also save in pumping electricity to get water. So all of that sort of stuff is what we need to be spending time on in terms of that carbon management plan. And again, Townsville will continue this process. So if we don't reach level 2, we certainly should reach level 1, but their aspiration at the moment is leapfrogging and jumping ahead. Mount Isa car park. So we did a massive upgrade for Mount Isa car park last year. However, the solar works around that was only completed in April this year. And it has been significantly helpful for the airport, for the community, not from only a safety and customer experience perspective, but from a electricity consumption perspective. So what we did here was we built some extra car park spaces and car rental spaces, and we've got solar shades now of 135 with solar panels on them. Now, at the moment, 4 months in, we're seeing 50-ish% electricity consumption down. We're expecting up to 80%, which will then boost the dollars around that. But I was up in Mount Isa a month ago, and I think at 11 o'clock in the morning, we said it was something like 90% off the grid, not just for the terminal, but for the surrounding property. So that's a pretty good result. And remember, Mount Isa, probably about 10 hours of sunshine a day. So it makes sense. In all these places, it makes complete sense compared to, say, your Sydneys and Melbournes. But Mount Isa's been a really good effort for us, and the guys are working on level 1 carbon accreditation as well. Longreach Solar, same sort of thing. We put it on the terminal roof, small amount of investment, 396 solar panels put on there and reducing and offsetting 95% of our daily loads. So again, pretty critical for a small airport. They're only around 30,000 packs a year. But again, it is a little bit around not just the financial, but the operational and the community, and obviously the greater good of sustainability. They're also working on level 1. So just to finalise, I think I'm out of time. The next steps, so from a Queensland Airport's perspective, a couple of things we need to do. The first one is put a better framework in on ESG. So for us, it's around building, business cases, building targets, making sure we're considering financial, operational, project risks, making sure we're considering the outcomes, and really that culture piece I talked about earlier. The second one is measurement. We've talked a bit about that, but we clearly need some targets. Without those, we can't really continue to get accredited. So really important piece for us. Innovation, so using sort of the more innovative thinking around what the opportunities are for the airport. And I've got some examples there which we've talked about, but even electric vehicles. At Gold Coast Airport, we've explored this only recently, and we can't do electric vehicles for certain types of vehicles, airfield, because of safety reasons. So we're now needing to tap into different ways to consider different types of vehicles, but still be sustainable. The fourth one is influencing our stakeholders. This is about engagement. A really important point. We have airlines. They're the biggest consumption. We know that. They're massive emissions. But certainly we've got to work with them, and we've got to work with all our other partners. Our tenants who are in our terminals, our rideshare drivers, we can encourage them to have electric cars. So there's a multiple stakeholder group that we work with as an airport, as you can imagine, and we need to encourage and make them contribute. They need to understand that, if they're going to be present and working with us, they need to be part of our strategy on that. So we will be working with them as part of the level 3 accreditation, but at the moment it's just discussions. And then finally, it's all about shareholder value in some ways. How do we evaluate investment decisions? Are we thinking about the right things? Have we got the best business case? And in terms of financing, are we being clever and creative enough about our financing? So that pretty much wraps up Queensland Airports. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over time, but hopefully that was interesting and insightful. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia, and some great insights there on that particular asset. And on presenting, I particularly like the theme of the intentionally small graph. I might use that in my next slide pack. Now, we have plenty of time for Q&A, and encourage everyone to log in and use the app, and they'll come to the stage and we can cycle through those questions. I guess one question I had to kick things off, in terms of the way you look for the payback for particular projects and the potential returns from your carbon reduction initiatives?
Yep, so we don't have any, ceilings or floors, limits set on that at this point in time. But for example, our Longreach airport, that was around a 6-year payback at a 15% IRR. So that's a pretty good result. Mount Isa, the benefits still need to be realised. I think the business case that went up was around 11% IRR. But again, every project is different. And clearly from an investor point of view, we always look to return close to cost of equity. So it is different by project. One of the things I think as part of that target process I talked about will be to make sure we are very clear what the hurdle rates need to look like before we actually proceed with any investment. So.
No, absolutely.
And I guess just to add to that, in terms of evaluation, there's also, as they do at Qual, is an evaluation of the risks as well. So there's the financial element to it, but there's also the qualitative aspects of how the risk assessment of those particular investments.
No, fantastic. And we also have a microphone, so I should have referred to in the room. So if anyone wants to stick their hand up, I will go there. The beauty of technology is we were set to the wrong. We're on the plenary session question, so I actually hadn't had any questions on the app, and I was trying to reach into that basket. I've now set it to Forum A, and we have a heap. So thanks everyone for contributing. I was a little worried there. I thought people were emailing on their phones, not putting up insightful questions. We have a great question here about, for you guys, things like the TCF framework. That's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has been developed and very much an investor-led process. How that's flowing into your thinking, and the sort of attach to that the sort of requests you're getting from investors and clients on these sorts of issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess from a Hastings perspective, we have a lot of queries in respect of ESG, in particular around climate change, and from our perspective, one of the benefits of undertaking the carbon footprinting exercise that we did was it helped inform our views on that. I think the task force is another additional tool that assists us in our thinking and how best to respond to investors and their needs, their wants, and what information ultimately serves their purposes.
And another question on that, I think in both presentations there was a discussion of Scope 3 emissions, or that broader challenge. Just your thinking on that, and again, it's just noted here in the question that, you know, are we sort of shirking the big issue or missing some of those major trends if you're not capturing those Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, it's a question of much debate as to whether you should be including Scope 3 in your studies. But I guess what's one person in Scope 3 emissions is that asset's actually Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions. So to my mind, the more participants who actually participate in measuring their carbon footprinting, it captures that Scope 3. That's not to say that there's not a role for the respective management teams of Qual and the management teams of UTA to play. That there certainly is, but I think there's if you were to include Scope 3, the outputs that presents would present a much different picture that is largely beyond the control of each of the assets. So there is a role to play. There is an influencing role, but that direct responsibility rests more with those participants.
Yeah, perhaps to reflect too, I think with a lot of the listed companies that we're researching, that Scope 3 is an interesting insight into that demand curve, or some of those externalities which could ultimately affect some infrastructure assets. So I assume it could be utilised the same way.
Yes, indeed, and it goes towards a multitude of risks that are assessed.
Mm-hmm. And look, just for our airports, you know, Scope 1 and 2 have been clearly what we've been looking at. We haven't ventured into Scope 3 for the same reasons Richard's described. So,
call out to just any questions from the floor. I've got a nice long iPad list now, so just wanted to check out there. There's a question here on, I guess, the balancing of financial, environmental and social metrics when you're making those business cases, and the sort of trade-offs that you potentially have to make.
Well, that's a great question. I ask that question often within our own organisation. So one of the things that I talked about before is how we manage our strategy and the pillars that underpin that strategy. And part of that is having a scorecard. So our scorecard essentially gives us insight into what our performance is across all those pillars. And if I look at, if I think about the metrics that we put in place for next year, it is around carbon accreditation, but I would say that there needs to be more than that in there. So we've just come off the back of a lot of strategic discussions around this, and I guess just to your point exactly, when we're making these decisions, it is about the balance, it is about where we're going to invest, and I think it is also practically about the priorities that we have in play in the year. So we know what our priority is this year. We know that ESG would be one of those, but it may not be the biggest, and so therefore that balance that you're talking about has to come into play there, alongside the risks as we talked about as well.
Yeah, and I think from a Hastings perspective, it's a similar response, I guess, and our assessment is similar, is that it forms part of the assessment, but it's not the sole assessment. Interestingly, one thing that we did as part of the carbon footprinting exercise was to explore if there's opportunities for the investors to offset their exposure to their carbon footprint. What we found from the results was that the carbon offsetting industry as a whole is still very much fragmented and still very much in an infancy stage. So it wasn't something that we pursued any further because we didn't feel it was appropriate at this point in time. But that's something that we'd look at in the future. And again, it's to put that into the holistic mix of how we assess these assets and to the extent possible give investors the choice to offset their carbon exposure in addition to carbon reduction opportunities.
And just to add, I mean, I think we also need to be really creative about whether we can tap into any grants or rebates out there. And there are a lot of government funds out there, you know, infrastructure funds that can be available. And I mentioned earlier about financing. You know, we need to think about whether there's financing for these sort of initiatives, and there are companies out there, and we have talked to them. So again, you know, that whole balance of investment, we have to tap into every source that we can to make sure that we are not, I guess, compromising on things that we should be doing, just because it doesn't stack up when it actually can. So.
And sorry, just to add to that, there's also a stakeholder piece there as well. So from if we look at our transmission assets, for example, their key source of emissions is from leakages on the transmission lines. Through technological improvements, those leakages can be reduced. However, there's a cost of doing that, and those assets are in a regulatory regime. So there is a regulatory overlay and education there with those particular stakeholders to convince them of the benefits of investment in those particular technologies and getting recoverability on those assets.
A very good segue, because our next top question, although our top question is, can we please turn down the air conditioning and reduce our carbon footprint? So I won't allow you guys to comment on that, but that's for others. It's for others to discuss, but we'd all agree. Just a question here on the purchase of Transgrid and just how that affected your approach to carbon footprinting, or whether it, changed your thinking on the process?
So, again, good question. The Transgrid comprises, I think, approximately 50% of the emissions of the portfolio. Like any investment that we undertake, we took a holistic approach to the ESG criteria that we put in place when we acquire all our assets. In terms of Transgrids, again, that was looked at in the mix of how that sits in the portfolio from a portfolio construction perspective, an investment perspective, and an ESG perspective. So from a carbon perspective, as I mentioned before, the key challenge for Transgrid is around leakages and how they can do that. So it wasn't something that we wouldn't consider because of its carbon footprint, but I think the benefit of what we've done is it helps inform us make better decisions around where we want to target our initiatives.